Reno Tirakatani.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to make a brief contribution. Just carrying on from my colleagues, the Honourable Nanaia Mahuta and Grant Robertson. We've spoken at length about the travesty of the loss of iconic names of like Te Waka Toi and Creative New Zealand, and the fact that those names will be off limits. And I think what I'd like to do, sir, is by extension, this piece of legislation will create a single arts council, the Arts Council of New Zealand, Toi Aotearoa. Surely, and it can't be called Creative New Zealand, but surely this is the body which funds the arts for Aotearoa. Surely they can think of a nicer name than Arts Council of New Zealand, Toi Aotearoa. So I'd like to make a prediction. I actually think there will be a new name that will be given to the Arts Council. And the same, I guess, will apply to the Māori committee, because the four representatives who are there for Māori, they might not necessarily be Māori, but those four representatives on that board form a committee. And I think it's a pretty sure bet that that committee will want to have its own name, as opposed to just being a committee set up under Section 11 of the Act. And so what we will see is a further rebranding exercise. There will be a rebranded Arts Council, and they'll give it a flash name, I hope, something that is fitting of our arts community of Aotearoa. And I'm very sure that the four members of the Māori committee will also want to have a beautiful Māori name to... Exactly, it could be Te Waka Toi. So, and it just shows you how redundant this, the provisions are, because we know in practical terms that, these names, they won't be able to use these names, but of course they will be moving into or creating their own trading names so that they can carry out their important mahi for the arts community. So I'd just like to draw that point, sir, because I think it just shows you how absurd this legislation is, and how wasteful it is, that the fact that we can't use iconic names like Te Waka Toi, prevented. No person, no organisation can have any association with that name. And as Mr. Robertson said, that already calls into contravention quite a number of arts bodies right across Aotearoa who use not only that name but the other term of Arts Council. I'd also just briefly, sir, like to go to the schedules, because I actually think that this piece of legislation is very misleading, sir, and I alluded to it in my earlier contribution. It's misleading in the fact that the resultant act will be called the Arts Council of New Zealand Arts Council of New Zealand Toi Aotearoa Act 2010. Now here we are at the end of 2013, going into 2014, we're going to be passing a piece of legislation which will be called from 2010. And it just refers to that. This piece of legislation was introduced back in the last Parliament. So what we're seeing here is it is misleading, because if you're going to go back 3 years, why not 10 years? Why not 20 years? Why not 30 years? You could make up a piece of legislation and put any start date on, or commencement date on it. I think that the commencement date really needs to be addressed, because it's misleading to say that it started back in the 1st of October 2010, and therefore it's a 2010 Act. I mean, I understand that issue was considered by the Select Committee, but it really makes a mockery of the whole legislative process if we can put through legislation and then just say that it gives effect back in time in 2010, it's from 2010, and the bodies and the persons that were in those positions were no longer in those positions back in the 1st of October 2010. And I think it should be addressed, and if it is amended, it needs to just amend it how it is and start the commencement date upon an appropriate time when the legislation is passed. Of course, we hope it doesn't really get to that point because we are opposing this bill, sir. That concludes speaking. Kia ora.
Chris Ockenvold.
I move that